All right. Well, welcome everyone. We'll get started, and I'm very happy today. So my name is William Morgan. I'm the CEO of Buoyant. Oh, I've got a slide introducing myself in a second. But welcome everyone to Anti-Complex Kubernetes. This is kind of our next edition on this recurring theme, and I'm very happy to be joined today by my esteemed guest, Rich Prillinger. Rich, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself in one slide, but hold on just 1 second. Because I want to talk about the topic. And the topic today is going to be about compute costs. So we're going to talk about the relationship between running Kubernetes and living the glorious and exciting life of a platform engineer or platform owner, and we then interact with the finance team who has to foot the bill for this at the end of the day. So, Rich, welcome. Thank you so much for joining me today. Would you mind introducing yourself?
Sure. Yeah, thank you for having me, Bill. Hello, I am Rich Prillinger. I am the Director of Platform at Mezmo, which is a, excuse me, we're working on some telemetry pipelines. We have a log analysis product that we're integrating with our pipeline capabilities. I've been in infra my whole career, starting out as a network engineer and then management levels of increasing responsibility over time, and dealing with the financial impacts of cloud costs has been a key part of my role for the last 3 roles I've been in. So thank you, Bill, for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. And what would you say, Rich, is your favorite piece of CNCF technology that starts with the letter L?
No, well, of course it's Linkerd.
Oh gosh, I'm so
use it all over the place.
I'm so warm to hear that just out of the blue like that. Really, makes me feel happy. All right, so so here's kind of the format of this. I'm going to give a brief introduction to kind of my view of complexity, simplicity, anti-complexity, that kind of stuff, and then we're going to dive right into the exciting and actually interesting part of this, which is going to be a conversation with Rich about making friends with your finance team. And that's obviously my editorial kind of like vision for this. But let me go through this notion of complexity first, and then we'll get into the good stuff. So if you were to ask anyone who uses Kubernetes, I think is Kubernetes complex? Everyone would basically say yes. Is that justified, or is that like a knee-jerk reaction? I mean, that's kind of the interesting question to me. As as a former engineer who's now blossomed into the beautiful CEO you see before you, one of the things that's always interesting to me, especially since for Linkerd's purposes, we're always talking about how Linkerd makes things simple. So what does it mean for something to be complex? What does it mean for a software system to be complex? What does it mean for a software system to be simple? How can Linkerd be simple? Can it be simple? Or is that just pure marketing? So the reason why we're so focused on this is kind of the foundations of the very early days of Linkerd and Buoyant, and we watched this really powerful talk and profound talk by Rich Hickey, who's the creator of Clojure, called Simple Made Easy, and it kind of like transformed a lot of the way that we were thinking about systems. And I'm not going to do the talk justice, but I would recommend that you go out and take a look at it. There's a recording online. And Rich kind of broke it down. Rich Hickey broke it down into easy versus simple versus complex. And we say briefly, when we say something is easy, we mean that it's near to us, kind of in terms of our capabilities. So you can imagine a wizard that like installs software. Under the hood could be doing all sorts of stuff, but for us it's one click, and then so that's quite easy, right? Whereas simple actually means something different. Simple means that it has one task, one job. It can be composed, it can be broken apart, it can be put together with other things. And complex means the opposite. So it's not really, in kind of normal English, we conflate easy and simple. We use them as synonyms. But when we're talking about software, it actually is pretty useful to distinguish, what is easy versus what is simple. And it's a fun kind of homework exercise, I think, which I'll leave to our listeners, which is to find examples of things that are simple but not easy, and things that are easy but not simple by these definitions. I gave one example of something that's easy but maybe not simple. But the best illustration of this, and I'm going to move on in a second, I promise, is this idea of the knitted castle. So I've got two pictures here. I've got a picture of a Lego castle on the right and a knitted castle on the left. And you can say from kind of the jobs to be done perspective, these are both castles, right? They've got whatever those castle things are on the top, and spires and happy people, and they protect you against intruders. But if you were asked to modify one of these castles, right, you would clearly want to modify the Lego castle. Modifying the knitted castle is going to be a tremendous amount of work. The Lego castle, you can break off a piece, you can add it. So that's a pretty good example, illustration, I think, of the difference between a simple implementation and a complex implementation. Okay, so the reason that's really relevant, I think, in the world of Kubernetes is because we actually require our platforms to do very complex things. And Rich, I know I'm kind of like I'm preaching to the choir here, but if you kind of compare what we're asking, we're building this platform on Kubernetes, if you kind of compare that to how things, the expectations of the platform that, Rich, you're on the hook for versus the expectations, of the platforms you've been on the hook for 10, 15 years ago, the expectations are quite different, right? Like today, things like encryption of data in transit and being able to scale to multiple clusters and having all these kind of reliability semantics and having uniform visibility are almost table stakes, right? And of course, we expect our platforms to never go down. There's no planned maintenance allowed, to scale to kind of arbitrary amounts of traffic, with zero notice. We have all these really complicated and severe demands on the platform. And so, of course, somehow, as the platform owner, our task is to accomplish those complicated tasks without producing a system that is itself so complicated that we can't modify it. And of course, without spending $1 million a second accomplishing this. That's where that's kind of like the the finance aspect. So if we look at Kubernetes specifically, what I think is so interesting about Kubernetes is, and I think it's to its credit, I put this quote here from Kelsey Hightower, which maybe has been kind of refined and revisited over the years. Kubernetes is a platform for building platforms, right? It has these really well-defined boundaries. And part of what makes Kubernetes so successful is they said, okay, we're going to do this stuff in this box, and we're not going to do other stuff. We're going to leave that other stuff for other components on the system. And so I looked through the CNCF survey from 2023. I filtered all those results out to find just the responses from people who were called mature cloud native organizations that were using Kubernetes at scale, that had lots of containers, that had been doing this for a couple of years. And I looked at what they reported in those results, and it was pretty interesting. 100% of them said, well, we use more than one project, of course, but the average was like 20 projects. They used 20 CNCF projects. That's not even talking about the non-CNCF projects that were in their stack, right? So you can imagine Kubernetes is like a base plate. Okay, we're adding not one or two Legos, but we end up adding 20. Seems like a lot, right? 90% of them were multi-cluster, 3/4 were multi-cloud, 60% were running, thousands of containers, and 57%. I was happy to see we're using a service mesh. The majority of them Linkerd. So, congrats, Rich. You joined the cool cloud, cool cloud club here. But then you're faced with this. You're kind of like faced with this scary picture here, where it's like, all right, I've got Kubernetes, and now I have to pick 20 projects from here, like to build a platform on. And there's of course a lot of discourse in the community about, well, is this good? Is this bad? Is this good? I think my instinct is that this is actually pretty good. Like, this is a sign of a really healthy ecosystem. It is kind of a scary picture if you're coming to this world new, right? There's a lot to learn. Okay, so I'm wending my way slowly to finance. So thank you for your patience as I go through my monologue. The problem with complexity, of course, is that it compounds. It starts out not really being that bad. You've got two pieces of thread, you weave them together, you're like, all right, that's fine. You add a third one, okay, still understandable. By the time you've knitted yourself a whole castle, now suddenly the relationship between each thread is really intricate. and hard to disentangle, right? So complexity will compound. It compounds over time, compounds with scale. It's not obvious on day one, very obvious on day 500. Of course, as engineers, like we know this. This is one of the things that we're trained to understand. This is one of the things that we are trained to, to watch out for. And in fact, sometimes we go too far, right? We start over engineering, and there's a whole kind of art and science to software engineering. So, Linkerd has always been known for its simplicity. Of course, and I kind of talked about our view of what that looks like. All sorts of things. I don't want to make this a Linkerd webinar, although I live and breathe Linkerd all day. But we did, we've always been focused on this idea of, well, how do we make Kubernetes is notorious for complexity. The service mesh itself is like, if anything, that whole space is more notorious for complexity. So how do we make Linkerd simple? Okay, how do we make it into a Lego castle versus a knitted castle? And one of the themes that I've been most interested in, and I'm not going to get too deep into this today, but there's this idea of anti-complexity, which is, if you think about anti-fragility, right? Really popular book from Nassim Nicholas Taleb called about anti-fragile systems, which are systems that are not just resilient or robust, but when you add stress to these systems, they actually get stronger with time, right? So it's not just they're resilient, they're actually anti-complex. Really interesting idea, right? And he gave a couple examples. Great book if you can read it. The human muscular system is the one that's the most obvious to me, right? Like you're pumping iron, you're kind of like hurting your muscles, and you're making these little micro tears, and the next day your body repairs itself if you got sufficient nutrition.
And for the record, bones are the same way. When you flex bones, that's what my wife did her PhD on, is how bones heal when they get flexed, and again, micro cracks and proteins, and
no kidding. Should we be working out our bones?
Yeah, well, when you flex your muscles, you're also flexing your bones a little bit, and that makes them thicker.
Yeah. All right. Well, so when I'm at the gym getting swole every day, I'm not just making my muscles bigger, I'm also increasing the strength of my bones. Sounds great.
There you go.
So that's an example of an anti-fragile system, and kind of my question, and I think I'll stop after this slide. But if we want to reason by analogy, right? We've got an anti-fragile system. That's something that gets stronger when it's under stress. Then an anti-complex system, it seems like that's something that's got a bit simpler when it's added to. So does that even make sense? Is that an idea that's worth pursuing? There's some examples of this behavior. I think in Linkerd, there's some examples of this behavior in some of the ecosystem projects, but I think we've really just scratched the surface of this concept. And I think as platforms especially evolve over time, maybe this is one of the ideas we need to start thinking about, which is not just simplicity, because simplicity ultimately, you can add a lot of simple things together. Is the overall result simple? Well, maybe. Can we actually make it simpler than before you added these things together? I think the answer might be yes. It leads to a lot of questions. So with all that out of the way, and that's kind of the theme for us, right? We're in the platform world. We're building on Kubernetes, whether we like it or not, whether we think it's simple or complex. Here we are. We're kind of stuck with it. The topic for today's webinar is the particular type of complexity that actually I really love, which is almost organizational complexity, which is, hey, we're building a platform. We're not just making it scalable and reliable and simple, but we actually have these business requirements we have to meet. We've got to deliver on our uptime goals. Of course, we've got to, there's probably compliance if your company gets large enough. There's compliance, that you can't say no to. It's not like an optional thing. And then there's finance as one of the many business drivers. So this is all a giant segue or a lead up, Rich, kind of start asking you some questions.
Let's get into it. Yeah.
All right. So here, I used AI, obviously, to generate this picture, which we're going to stare at for the remainder of this webinar, just to really get our mental juices flowing. I told it to generate a picture of some Kubernetes engineers and some finance people being befuddled by the financial impact of their Kubernetes platform, and then to add YAML in there. So you can see we've got, now I don't know that it really understood what YAML was, because it added like the word YAML in 6 different places. Rich, maybe you can just set the stage for us. You're someone who owns a platform, a highly scalable, highly performant platform in the context of a larger organization that has these business goals. What is your relationship to the finance team, and in kind of broad strokes, what have you learned is the best way to interact with them?
Sure. Well, I can speak from my experience. I've been the person that they go to help understand in the cloud era, what happened on this bill, right? And if you kind of look at the goals of a finance team versus the goals of an operations or infrastructure SRE team, they're not necessarily the same, right? Finance people are inclined to build a model and build a forecast and understand capital expenditure and amortization, and ultimately come up with a number that says, here's how much we expect to spend on this year. Or, here is the relationship between customer growth and infrastructure costs. And in the world of cloud, if you are embracing the benefits that cloud provides, mainly flexibility and easy scaling and access to quick access to new services, that by definition means it's going to be a variable monthly cost. And you got to kind of marry these two in some way. So, my relationship is with our finance team, I think is healthy. We discuss some of that. We discuss where in my forecast models I'm going to need some leeway because of those factors, and we talk through that. But I also work to reduce some of that complexity for them. They don't need to understand Kubernetes and block storage and S3 and zone costs and these things, right? So we build a spreadsheet. I have some inputs to that that build out a forecast, but ultimately they're interested in the number at the bottom. So I guess in a nutshell, I would say I expose some of the complexity to them, but I don't expect them to fully understand it. We have different jobs here. And in the same way, I learn a lot from them around how they think about, what is COGS, what is OPEX, and similar, so.
Yeah. So are they, so it sounds like from them, kind of the ideal perspective or the ideal platform would be one with totally predictable costs, and there's like a source of tension because the platform costs tend to change. Do those changes, are those changes in costs, are they in response to kind of like differences in customer activity, or are they responses to kind of product development efforts, or other things? Because at the platform layer, it seems like you're kind of decoupled a little bit from those things.
Yeah. So first, to validate what you said, absolutely. Uh-oh. You still hear me?
Oh yeah.
Okay. Just to validate what you said, absolutely. Finance loved the old world of buying servers that had a fixed cost, and you put it in a rack and you amortize it, and it was very predictable. But now we're in a world where we want to scale up, scale down. So the variability, for us, largely comes with, our product in particular. We ingest log data and telemetry data, and a given customer may have an outage, may have some condition where suddenly they're sending us 4 times the log data. And we try to find the line between what's an efficient level of infrastructure to run and some buffer capacity to absorb those spikes. Sometimes we have to quickly react and add capacity. So some of that's normal customer activity. Over time, as we acquire customers, we have to scale up in a more predictable, routine fashion. And then there's let's look at Lambda. Let's look at new VPC features. Let's look at AI features, right? So we have to kind of categorize those. And we've done a pretty good job here of keeping what we consider production costs separate from everything else, let's just say, where the developers might experiment in an environment with new features doesn't hit the production cogs because it's in a separate account. And sometimes we drill into that for details, sometimes we don't. It depends on if the finance team is curious how much, say, how much is it costing us to investigate this AI feature set we want to do, right? And we can go dig in. But having production be very much a sort of walled space, very few people could actually deploy into production, which allows us to kind of control and predict. And I can run my reports on that. And that's obviously our highest cloud cost is production.
Right. Right. Do you ever run into situations where there's, because you're building the platform, but there's also there's a set of developers, right? The platform is kind of there to serve. The platform is ultimately there to serve, like, the business logic of the application. Do you ever run into a situation where there's kind of like product initiatives and suddenly a whole bunch of new workloads are spun up on the platform, and then you're on the hook for finance to kind of justify these things that you're not directly involved in? Or is there more coordination?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, we within the last year, 18 months, we did come out with a new product that has had some new infrastructure needs. I consider myself very lucky, but it's in the sense that at least in my current role, I'm not viewed as the cause of cost. Right. I am viewed as the person who understands it, right? And so, but that doesn't come, that comes through having regular conversations with finance and pointing out, we're releasing this new product. It's going to need this stuff. It's going to send data here and there. And here's the best I can estimate that that's going to be right now. But ultimately, growth rates and data volumes are going to I would say, hopefully you can hear me. I would say that's something to get ahead of, right? Have your relationship with the finance team and talk about those things ahead of time. They don't, you don't want them similar to I appear to be having a very flaky internet connection today.
No worries. We may have lost you for the second half of that answer.
It's very, very much the same as, outages are not the fault of SRE or operations, right? But in a less than ideal culture, people expect the operations team to prevent outages even when they're caused by, code pushes, things like that.
Right.
So proactively have that partnership with the finance team and make sure they're aware of what's coming. New products, expected growth, major new customers. Maybe something's changing with your provider. We've got a new contract that's going to change our costs. And then they can understand that things change. But if it's all of a sudden, here's this bill and the money's already spent, that's a much harder conversation.
Right. Yeah. So that leads me to my next question, which you've kind of half started to answer already, which is, if you were giving advice to someone who's new into the situation, who was like maybe interacting, just got promoted, has this new scope of ownership, is starting to interact with the finance team for the very first time, what is the advice that you would give to them, especially around maybe getting ahead of some of those questions?
Yeah, well, that's good. So I sort of start by, on the topic of this webinar, I start by sharing some of the complexity and gauge their reaction to it. Are they really interested in the level of detail of pods and cores and memory, and or are they sort of more interested in the result of that, sort of the summation of that? Mm-hmm. And I have found that people are interested in it, but then you realize, well, they have a job that isn't to manage that, and so what's a way that we can get this information and understand the relationship of the growth of, say, our pipeline product with number of cores devoted to pipeline, right? And then I can partner with them and make sure we're tagging things appropriately and generate the reports and give them the data they need. It is a two-way street. They might ask for things that I might not intuitively be able to answer without some thinking, right? For example, when we came out with our second product, they wanted to have a separate COGS model for that product, but we're all running it in one big cluster in production. So, and I'll say at least one cloud provider does not provide an easy way to do tagging on containers. So how do you do that, right?
Yeah.
And we played with Kubernetes taints and putting things on separate nodes, and ultimately that's what we did. So we've got some separate infrastructure in the same cluster that is tagged. And the other thing that we'd really love is to get better data attribution for data flows. Right. And that's harder too in the Kubernetes world. Right. So that's still a work in progress. But understanding what they're after too at the high level, I might not be able to fix it right away, but as we scale, as we grow, there is an accountability there that we can report on.
Yeah, it almost reminds me of, I worked at Twitter a decade ago, well before the current incarnation. But at that point, we were just starting to kind of scratch the surface of the attribution question, which is, okay, we're big enough now that we kind of have different organizations within the company that have their own budgets. But obviously, there's these core infrastructure services that are hugely expensive because they serve all these other parts of the business. And then there's like the revenue generating services over here, which are quite lightweight and easy to justify because you're making lots of money. And then these product services over here that are hugely expensive. And so how do we decide which, which organization, out of which budget each component comes from, and how are you divvying up those costs? That may be, kind of like late stage platform thought, you get into things like chargeback and stuff like that.
Yeah, there's definitely a maturity aspect of this, right? When you're young company, some of this doesn't really matter that much. Everything's R&D, the product's not really ready. We haven't gone to the chargeback level yet, and maybe we will one day, but we do have we spend time periodically going through the non-production costs and trying to figure out what's what. And so far, we make it through the audits, right? So we're doing okay at that. But I think, what's the highest value thing to go after? And obviously saving money is a goal, but for us, it's getting an accurate view of our COGS. I mean, I'm sort of proud we got so far this year, we're within 2% of our forecast, despite a bunch of things going on this year, platform migrations and customer growth. There is an element, I won't lie, of luck there. But we did spend a lot of time trying to figure it out. So,
Yeah, great. Well, we ran a poll, which there's a poll that's open now, but there's one that we ran a little bit earlier, where we asked asked attendees of this very webinar to describe the relationship between their platform team and the finance team. And there are only a couple of responses, so it's not, statistically significant, but most people said it's pretty collaborative. We work well together, so that was good. There was one respondent who said challenging. It's hard to align the technical and financial goals, which I think is, probably a reality for some people. Your question or your comment about using the Kubernetes taints to kind of like schedule workloads on certain nodes in response to like a financial, requirement or request maybe, kind of leads me to my next question, which is, we've been talking pretty generally about, platforms and things and the relationship between the platform team and the finance team. Is there anything about Kubernetes specifically that makes this easier or harder? Is that taint thing something that solved a real problem, or is it just a kind of like a convenient thing? What's your sense of the value of Kubernetes itself for like the finance team, which is not its immediate audience.
Yeah, certainly. Well, going back to sort of the old school, buy a server, put it in a rack, it does a thing. That got a little muddy when VMs became popular, and now it's even muddier with Kubernetes. So educate the finance team that a given server, use the old school words, right? Because that's ultimately still what it is, right? Does 100 different things depending on where a workload has been scheduled. The way I try to tease out the complexity for them is pull a Kubernetes inventory, add up the number of cores and memory, and then just go against the price per unit from the cloud provider. And here's what it costs to run our log ingestion. Here's what it costs to run this. And they don't need to see that there's 84 pods and each one's 2 cores and 4 gigs. Come on.
You're back.
In that early conversation, I exposed them to the complexity so they understand what's underneath the covers there and what I'm providing to them. So I would say it's more complicated, but I bear the burden of that, of simplifying that for the finance team. There may be a really mature FinOps team out there that wants all of that information and they want it, once an hour, and they want to build a, very complex model that could exist. But for me, that's how I sort of manage that complexity. Is I let my data, the engineers running the day to day, they are free to do what needs to be done to manage the platform and keep it scaled and operating. I place no restrictions on them, and I try to simplify the end result and present it, in alignment with what I think the finance team wants to know. And it's a bit of back and forth.
Yeah, I'm sure. For those of you who are listening in right now, there is, I kind of mentioned this in the chat, but there is a Q&A section. So if you we've got Rich here, he's being recorded, it's live. If you want to ask him a high pressure, really difficult question, now is your opportunity. Just put it into that Q&A section. And I'll try and get it to him. It doesn't actually have to be a high pressure, scary question. It can just be a regular question. But you got one of the world's foremost experts on the intersection of finance and Kubernetes. So ask away. Let's see if we can get some audience questions in here. Until then,
it looks like we just talked about the first one there.
Yes, that's right.
And then. At the broadest level, communicating the value of a platform to non-technical stakeholders. Yeah, this is something that I am just one part of this, right? Other folks in engineering, both senior SMEs and management. This is a collective job to communicate how shared and common ways of building things enable easier integrations and growth. I mean, one of the tools I've used to help sort of demonstrate this is we have done, I think, 3 major platform infrastructure migrations in my time here, from bare metal to AWS to a different backend storage solution twice. And you know what? It wasn't perfect, but we were containerized from the beginning, and so those migrations were fairly painless as migrations go. When I think about earlier in my career trying to cut over a data center or something, it was
fairly painless is like an astonishing success for that type of thing, because really only 2 outcomes. It's either like disastrous or like fairly painless. Every time Rich's internet goes away, I'm gonna say this is why Big Marker needs a service mesh, because
I mean, and this is an ongoing challenge, right? I won't, because there's business needs and product needs. They want to build the new next thing, and we need to spend time making sure our APIs work together. And so this is I think communicating the value of a platform is an ongoing.
Yeah.
There is, just as a side note, if any of you have heard of the Dora report, there's a whole section that just came out a couple weeks ago on platforms and where they add value. And
yeah, I feel like the notion of a platform is not really controversial these days. So I'd be surprised if anyone ever like took you by the collar and was like, Rich, justify your existence. Why is a platform? Why do we even need that? I feel like, as an industry, certainly, the section of the industry that's adopting Kubernetes, like you're doing that for a reason. You're doing that because you've realized, hey, the way we structure our application, in subject to the constraints of the business is, well, there's a platform layer and there's an application layer, and they kind of have this relationship, in addition to like the many other layers. So I'd be surprised if that was really controversial, although maybe there was a period of time, or maybe there's an industry where it still is, kind of a significant debate. Like, do we need a platform versus just like, why can't you just write the application, man?
Right. Yeah. There's a right time to start standardizing, and really a platform is just another way of saying we've standardized the way we do some of these things. And,
you mentioned a little bit about how one of the cloud providers made things harder than others in terms of like understanding how to attribute some of the costs. Is there anything kind of from the, because your examples about like the good old days, as the finance people liked, have all been kind of like the on-prems, like we bought this physical hardware. Is there anything that the cloud providers do or don't do that makes your life harder? Or is that kind of all handled by Kubernetes? Ultimately, do you look at, do you have like Kubernetes specific tools, or do you end up using kind of cloud provider specific tools when you're answering some of these questions?
A bit of both. I mean, I certainly have my gripes with how they, bill and do some of they're solving a different problem than what I need, right? So,
and billing, understandability is maybe not in their best interest anyway. So it may not be intentional, but I'm sure there's like, well, we don't need to really prioritize that, do we?
100%. I mean, and in their defense, right? If they tried to capture an invoice on every single event that happened, who knows how long that invoice would be, right? So,
right, yeah.
Some
probably need a system like Mezmo in the back end to be able to process that magnitude of data.
Yeah, for us, I take a combination of things. So, we've tagged our resources so I can look at the compute and get an aggregate compute cost, and then I go to Kubernetes and understand how we're using that pool of compute. And what's our overhead, and the old Tetris fitting the most on the least problem.
Right.
And there's a lot of tools that do that. It's a very crowded space in the sort of cost optimization, FinOps space. I haven't found the need to do a report on that very often. I try to grab my own snapshots every few days because I know later I need to look back at things sometimes. We spend a lot of time during forecast season, and then when we make big changes, I like to verify them. But I'm pulling data from Kubernetes. I'm pulling data from, the cost tools. I'm pulling data from the APIs from the cloud providers, and what is it I need to report on? I must admit, it's been a long time since I've written what I would call legitimate code. So my stuff is a little bit of a mishmash of scripts, but it gets me what I need. And
right.
So it's very similar to what a lot of the commercial tools out there will do once they have the right access, right? So,
yeah. Okay. Yeah, no, that's really helpful. We've got about 5 minutes left, so I do have another couple of questions for you. But before we do that, I did want to just point out, I'm actually, as part of this webinar series, I'm sacrificing myself. No, not really, but I'm doing a couple one-on-one meetings with attendees from the webinar. So if anyone here wants to talk to me and get my many opinions about how to build Kubernetes platforms informed as best I can by experts like Rich and Phil and Reese and some of the other folks we've had on the series. I'm more than open to doing a conversation with a handful of folks. So just click the button, or you'll get an email after the webinar, and you can sign up. I'm only going to have a handful of slots due to time constraints, but I would love to talk to anyone who's struggling with the challenges like, well, how do I effectively build a Kubernetes platform? Because a lot of our customers have gone through a lot of kind of a variety of challenges. So we've kind of distilled some of the stuff that seems to have worked the best. So please do click on that thing or respond to the email afterwards. Thank you. So Rich, just kind of at the tail end here, we kind of talked about our the advice that you would give to someone who is new to this. Do you have any I don't know, maybe this is not a fair question, but do you have any like horror stories or any disastrous kind of like events or times that you were in trouble because you made some kind of tragic error or anything like that to kind of like get our blood flowing? Or maybe you've just had the perfect, wonderful life where you've avoided all of that.
No, things happen, right? I think when you ask that, the story that comes to mind would be when we first went to the cloud from bare metal. One of the things the cloud charges for that bare metal does not typically is interzone costs. So we had nice 3 zones set up in bare metal, and we went to the cloud, and all of a sudden we had $6,000 a day of zone costs that we were not experiencing before. We did not predict. We understood from our account manager those were going to be not existent. And the long and short of it is we had a couple months of extreme unpredicted costs that sort of suck. That that provides. It's not like the product was suddenly better. It just was just a hit. Engineering had to spend a bunch of time working on zone awareness that we just didn't have to care about before.
Yeah.
So that was something we just didn't expect, and that was kind of rotten. When's it going to be fixed? When's it going to be fixed? And there's no one fix for it, right? It was a bunch of little things. All these different, many different components in the stack had to be made zone aware, not just ingestion, but storage. So that was not fun.
Well, you're definitely not the only one who's bumped into that, because we've definitely seen a lot of customers who, the best practice in all the docs is like, well, have this nice multi-zone cluster. Of course you want reliability. What if one zone goes down? Well, you wouldn't want your cluster to go down. But then, if you're on AWS, especially, they charge you for all the traffic in between zones. And meanwhile, Kubernetes is doing its best job, right? It's like, I'm going to balance load evenly across all zones. And then you end up in this situation where you're like millions of dollars in the hole, and you're like, well, that's horrible. There are Kubernetes features. I'm sure I don't have to tell you this, like topology aware routing, that can start doing that. We actually introduced a feature in Buoyant Enterprise for Linkerd called Hazel, high availability zone aware load balancing. That has been really effective for for a lot of our customers in reducing that without sacrificing reliability. Lots of fun stuff to talk about here. I should have asked you that question earlier, because you just touched on a topic that's so near and dear to my heart, which is like,
I swear that was not a
zone costs.
That was not a plant question, I swear.
All right. Well, Rich, we're at the very tail end of our webinar, and I want to be respectful of your time. Thank you so much for joining us. I learned a lot. Audience, I hope you learned a lot. And Rich, you have any final words of wisdom you want to impart on us?
Well, first, thank you for having me. My best word of wisdom would be partner early, partner often, and help them understand the world that you're operating in, so that you have some grace when you need it, because you will need it eventually. And happy to answer any questions afterwards as well, if anyone wants to reach out.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, thank you all so much. Really appreciate your time today. Rich, thank you again. We've all learned a lot. So thank you, folks. And please join us for the next webinar. You'll get a little notification about that soon enough. Won't be quite as good as this one, but it'll be almost as good.
Thank you, William. Thank you all for coming.
Thanks, folks.